Leave. All right. I am really excited to have this conversation today because I reach out to folks who might have a real workplace conflict experience so that I could unpack it live, protecting what's the word? Anonymity. So protecting that. And so I want to just share what we learned. And also thanks for the person that contributed the question, because I think that what they shared is probably what many folks are experiencing as well. So let me jump right into it. This episode of this YouTube live, if I could call it such, is focused on a real workplace case study. And I actually think what I want to talk about is almost like deeper than what the person shared. I want to be able to share more than just the workplace conflict. I want to actually talk about the context around it. And I also want to talk about why it matters in the first place, that we don't just look at the problem, but the context and circumstances around it. So, with that, let's dig into the real workplace conflict example. Okay. So, here's the example that I was provided with by someone over email. Here's what they said. Thank you for the opportunity to provide you with feedback. Honestly, I wish I could have prepared myself more for the defensiveness I experienced after the meeting when I took the brave step to call them. I'm assuming they're coworkers. And this person said, furthermore, I wish I knew what to say to the people who were witnesses to the exchange. So let's take a moment just to imagine that we are in a meeting. We are watching some problematic behavior show up. And think to yourself, have you ever witnessed that? I was just facilitating a retreat and a strategy and healing session. It was all three yesterday with a client. And one of the things that emerged from the people that I spoke to, and was a year ago that this incident happened. But what they shared in this debrief and very restorative healing session was that they wish that and not everybody, but maybe half of the room verbalized that they wish that they had said something. They watched this behavior go down that was problematic. In their gut, they knew that it was problematic, but they didn't say anything. They didn't say anything. And they expressed guilt a year later that they wish they would have. On the other side, you have the folks who witnessed the problematic behavior and they did address it, right? They addressed it in the best way that they could, but it wasn't necessarily well received by the team. So it didn't get resolved in that moment. And so I'm using this one example, but I want to illustrate that this happens so often, and we don't have the skills all the time where we are able to address that problematic behavior in real time, where we're able to take accountability or ask for accountability in real time. And so you get questions like the one that I was shared with today. So again, I'm sharing this because I don't want you to think that it's just this one person. This is many people, and perhaps you, and if not you, someone on your team. So let me back it up. Here's the thing that they raised. They said they experienced defensiveness when they raised the issue. Okay, so we know that's a thing. And we know that they noticed that there were other witnesses and nobody else spoke up. So then what do you do with that? It's a big question about what do you do? In my client work, I'm always saying, I don't expect everybody to be a conflict expert, to navigate with ease and expertise, but we've got to do something. So let's start to break down the scenario in pieces. So the first thing that I want to highlight, again, they said that they, took the brave step to call them in. I want to make sure that I clarify what calling in actually is. So here's what I will say. When I'm talking about calling in, I'm actually specifically talking about the act of identifying problematic behavior, and then you're explaining what that misstep was, but you're doing it with compassion and with patience. And then you're inviting folks to change. So that's calling in. And you may have heard another term called calling out. This is all semantics, right? Language. But just to be clear, when we talk or you hear folks talk about calling out, that's basically you have seen a problematic behavior, but as opposed to trying to address that behavior with an individual with the hope that they can hear your compassion and want to change, calling out almost has a like a you got it kind of energy. Like I'm going to show you and I'm going to do it on a public stage so that other people can come for you to get you in trouble. And so there's an energy of blame, there's an energy of punishment that comes with calling out. So I want to make this distinction. When the person in the example shared that they called some team members in, they were doing this more empathy driven, compassion driven identification of what the problematic behavior was, and then inviting that person to take that feedback that was offered with care and then to make a shift. So that's calling in. So let's go back again. So we've got kind of what calling in is. We know what the person in our scenario offered. Again, so they called somebody in, and then they said that they experienced defensiveness. Okay. I think there's an important element of calling in too. And this is what I would offer. If you were to call somebody in, you want to highlight some behavior that was misaligned with what you would have hoped, people aren't mind readers. And so in a team setting, this is why it's important to have what I call some baseline understanding of what's acceptable in terms of our behavior. So it's really hard to call people in a work environment if there isn't really a shared understanding of the misstep. So how do you get to shared understanding of a misstep or that something is a misstep at all? Again, I worked with a client in their conflict resiliency restoration session, and there was a behavior of asking questions. Asking questions is on face not problematic, it's not harmful, but there's context that matters. Did you ask these interrogation style questions to everyone or just to the person of color because you have a belief that perhaps that person or that group isn't as rigorous, right? There were some subtext maybe that people aren't even aware of when they're doing a behavior that on face is, I'd say, innocent, but has a harmful impact. So I share this because it's hard to call people in on a misstep if they don't know what they did could be a misstep in the first place. So how do you identify if there is shared understanding? The first thing that I offer is what are the cultural values of this place? So every company has a mission statement, a vision statement. Generally, there are some values statements, and all of that shapes what I call the norm. What are the norms here? How do we do business here? How do we act here? So think about where you are in your workplace. What do you value? Right? Is it acceptable to yell at people, or is the cultural value to speak with empathy or with care? Right? These are what I mean. What are the values? Is your value around individualism? So do whatever you got to do to be successful and win, or are your values related to collaboration? Because that's actually going to shape the behavior of what y'all do. I'm going to fix this camera. All right. The other thing I want to share too is that there are codes of conduct. So many organizations have a code of conduct where they literally legislate what behaviors are acceptable and what behaviors are not. There might be just generally accepted practices. So what I mean by that is like generally here we don't make jokes or comments about people's gender or gender expression. Right? That's just, it's not in the code of conduct, maybe explicitly, it's not even on the value statement, but generally we accept that that's how we operate here. So if someone does that behavior, we know it's not allowed until we can call them in or hold them accountable. And then one thing that I find that many teams don't have is what I call established team agreements. So, what are your team's agreements for how you'll work together, how you'll talk to each other, how you'll behave in meeting spaces, and even how your meeting spaces are designed? So on September 5th of this year, in Los Angeles, I'm actually hosting a 1 day conflict resiliency intensive. And I use the word conflict resiliency because the idea is, how do we bounce back when we experience disrespect, conflict, misunderstandings? And in that session, we'll be talking about the personal part of getting better at conflict, being resilient at conflict. But then we will also be talking about what are the structures, or what we call the conflict infrastructure, that you need in place in your organization to help everybody identify those hot spots and get better at navigating conflict, misunderstandings, and miscommunications. But this is you got to have team agreements. So let's say, again, in our scenario, again, just to go back to the scenario, the person shared this. They said that they are experiencing, rather in the experience, they experienced defensiveness from folks when they were called in. So I'm imagining here that in this scenario, there were some shared agreements. There were some shared agreements about how to be, whether that was, again, they had some cultural values, they had team agreements, code of conduct, something was in place on this team. And that allowed this person to call in someone else because they were in violation, or they were moving in a way that was misaligned with one of these things. Okay. So now let's break it to the next part of this case study, which was around defensiveness. So I always say that saying, if I point a finger at you, I've got three more pointing at me, right? So I try to be introspective. But that doesn't mean that I'm immune to disrespect. If you're particularly in a workplace environment, and someone points a finger, that's how it will feel. And they elevate how you engage in some behavior. You said something that was not aligned to the cultural values or the code of conduct or a team agreement. It can feel like they're coming for me. I did something and they're shining a light on it. And that will spark defensiveness. It's a natural human reaction. But I wanted to take a moment to also get underneath about what is causing that defensiveness. So why do we get defensive in the first place? Well, the first is shame. Every single person, since we were babies, we want to feel loved and cared for and important, and that we matter. And when someone shines a light on a behavior that we engaged in, that is maybe not how we want it to be, maybe it goes against the team's agreements for how we're supposed to be, it activates that inner part of shame, right? When we develop our emotional intelligence skills and our emotional regulation, we're able to separate our identity from the misstep that we've made. But for many people who haven't done that deep emotional regulation work, it's all tied in together. Right? We're going to touch on that at the Conflict Resiliency Intensive, but I will say that this is such a critical part, because we can't hear feedback and then we can't move to the next step of accountability and repair if we are stuck in a shame spiral. But I want to flag that is present in our meeting spaces, and we've got to get clear about how we even honor that in that team meeting, you had all of your colleagues there, you had the person that you called in, and you had shame at the table as well. And so as you want to work through the issue that you're calling folks in about, you got to talk to the shame. You've got to talk to the shame and address it. The second thing that you have to know when people are defensive is that there could be a fear attached. So I remember years ago, I worked for a leader, and they offered me a coach. But this is how I remember experiencing it. Chrysta, have you thought about a coach? Do you want a coach? I think you might benefit from a coach. And what I heard in that statement was, am I a bad worker? Am I going to be fired? Am I getting offered a coach because I'm seen as not qualified, and it made me defensive. And so I remember saying to our CEO, "No, I don't need a coach. I have one." And I remember that to this day. Now being a life and leadership coach, I can remember distinctly. This was 17, 20 years ago. And I wish I would have taken the opportunity to get that coach. But I let fear, and number three here, my lack of skill or the area where I can develop, get in the way of an opportunity. To get in the it got in the way of me having a deeper understanding of myself and of others and how to relate better to others. So the third reason that people get defensive is that maybe they have a lack of skill. And when I say that a lack of skill, that's not me being derogatory or trying to shame people. It's that all of us are works in progress, and all of us have area and room where we can grow. And so if somebody calls us in because we haven't done something, we're operating out of order compared to our agreements, it's shining a light on that area of development. It's shining a light on where we're weak and where we could be stronger, but we're not yet. And that can make us feel in a way that we have to defend what we do know, that we do have skills, or we didn't do the thing that they said. Because if we did the thing they say we did, then that proves that we are underskilled. A fourth reason that folks get defensive is that they misunderstand what the call-in was. So I worked with a client a while back, and there was a lot of just extra attention, barrage of questions. There was something that didn't quite feel good from one of their Black leaders. And so what the Black leader shared is, I'm experiencing what is happening as anti-Black. Now, it's clear that that is a very charged word, right? To be called, or rather to have a word like that's ableist, or what I'm experiencing is ableist, or what I'm experiencing is anti-Black, or what I'm experiencing here feels very anti-women. And so for many of us, if not all of us, if we said something and then directly after someone said, "Hey, this is feeling fill-in-ism," we're going to feel personally attacked. We're going to feel that our character, our worthiness is being called into question. And I think what's important oftentimes is that the call-in is not about you as a person. It's not about us as worthy human beings, worthy of dignity and honor. It's the idea of the behavior and the person. And we don't do a great job separating the actions of a person, the behavior of a person, a thing that they did, and separating that from the person. Meaning, you can be a good person who did something bad, who created harm, and still be a good person. But that misunderstanding of the call-in, and the example of my client, I'm sure for some people, when they named that the thing that they were experiencing was anti-Black, somebody probably heard that as, you're anti-Black, you're being anti-Black, you hate Black people, and you go down the ladder, you're a racist, horrible human being. Which was not what the call-in was. The call-in in that example of my client was to ask the question of, is how we are currently operating in service of our Black clients and staff, or is it harming them, and only because they are Black? That's the systemic analysis question. But I know that it probably landed as a personal attack, and that shapes defensiveness. And then the other thing, and this is why I talk so much in my conflict resiliency, any training or our intensive, I talk about our conflict stories matter. So when we talk about a conflict story, what I mean is all of us since birth have been observers and participants in disagreement, disrespect, misunderstandings, serious disagreements, and conflict, right? Full-on fights that have happened. And so when we're in a work environment and someone calls us in, even though they're being called in for the thing that happened in this moment, that call in may start to trigger stuff that happened before. It might trigger our sense of identity, and it might trigger the way that that misunderstanding or conflict played out 5, even 10, 20 years ago. But now all of that is showing up in the meeting space, and it makes us defensive, right? So past trauma, past conflict, history is also one of the underlying reasons that we experience that defensiveness in conflict. I think that is so important because we don't really talk about the history of conflict. We don't talk about our conflict stories or our orientation to conflict. Generally, when we get called in my company to address conflict or any kind of tension, we're only being asked to talk about what happened in that one moment where something popped up. And we're missing so much opportunity to understand the rest of it. So I want to talk about this next concept about what you can do, because that was something that I felt was implicit in the question that we got asked. So the idea is, what do you do or what can you say when people become defensive in a space? I want to flip it for a moment and I want to offer you this. If you are in a situation where there's opposing opinions, there is disagreement, you've been said to be out of alignment with the agreements, here's something that you can do for yourself. Ask yourself this practice. When I feel defensive, what story am I telling myself about what this means about me, my worth, or my belonging on this team? This will help people get underneath why they feel defensive. And it might be hard to do this practice when you first try it, but I will tell you, using this and the feelings wheel that we bring into all of our trainings, we brought a printed copy yesterday to help people put a language around what is bubbling up for them in these moments of tension and conflict. Most people are so disassociated from their feelings and from what they need that it makes it harder for them to engage in conversation, especially when there's high stakes, high emotion, and opposing viewpoints. So when the question was, how do I address people's defensiveness? I think one thing that you can say is to acknowledge, right? I'm calling you in because, using my client example, not the one who messaged us, what is happening right now feels very anti-Black. And then you can speak directly to the defensiveness. So imagine that the defensiveness is sitting in a chair beside that person. You could say this: I understand that what I said may have activated you and had you show up, had defensiveness show up. What I'm offering is less trying to harm you or to critique you or to make you not feel worthy. I value you as a colleague, as a collaborator, but I want to address this behavior because, again, going back here, because we have some shared agreements about what's acceptable, about how to be with one another. And it doesn't seem like that value or these values are reflected in what I'm seeing you say and do. So I'm wanting to know, what can we do so that what you want to offer is able to be expressed, but it's being able to be expressed in a way that's aligned to our values, our code of conduct, or our agreement, right? So that's how you can address the defensiveness that comes up when folks are sharing and you see that defensiveness show up. So let's go back to this case study. So they said, okay, I wish I could have prepared myself for the defensiveness. Again, the preparing part, assume that defensiveness is going to show up. It's going to, like that Bewitched show, it's going to poof and show up and be in a chair in your meeting. So you're going to have to talk directly to that defensiveness. And this is one of the trigger escalation techniques that I teach in my intensives to help you figure out what for you and for others gets people from a calm state and escalates them up to defense and moving in opposition. Okay, then they said, furthermore, I wish I knew what to say to the people who were witnesses of the exchange. And I'm assuming in this scenario, there were people who witnessed the exchange who didn't speak up. And so I want to talk about this part two, this idea that how do we address bystanders? One thing I'll share, this just came to mind. Years ago, there was a report in the New York Times, and I want to say the article was about microaggressions, and they interviewed really a top researcher and writer on microaggressions, Dr. I want to say it's Nadal or Nadal, Nadal. And what struck me in this New York Times piece was that it mirrored my own professional experience after 17 years in the field. What it said was 60% of us will witness something like a microaggression. And a microaggression, if you go back here, generally accepted practices, right? So it might not be in the code of conduct at your company, but we know we shouldn't touch a Black woman's hair. Or really, we shouldn't touch anybody's body without express consent. If we are relegating only the female staff to clean up the break room, that's a gender-based microaggression. Like, well, you clean it. Why? Well, you're better at it than me. Why? Because I'm a woman. Real exchange that happened in one of my clients' faces. So the idea is that we all have an understanding about what is acceptable and what's not. And yet people don't speak up. Right? According to at least the microaggression study, 60% of us don't. So the question becomes why? If we all saw it and we know that somebody should say something, why do only 40% of us speak up? There's a lot of reasons why. Fear, shame. Well, I've done it too, so I can't speak on that. I've done it myself. Fear looks like, well, I wasn't directly involved. I don't know the right things to say. I don't want to make it worse. I need the script. Maybe somebody else will do it. Maybe a person that's in leadership should be the one. There's so much happening psychologically and emotionally behind why folks don't speak up. So then that leads me as someone who creates spaces for groups to do their best thinking, to strategize, or even my work with culture transformation, where you have entire workforces full of people that you have to tend to. I start thinking about, well, what are the conditions or the structures that are needed for people to speak up in the first place? Here's what I've come up in my work. First thing that I've thought about is that, well, in order for people to speak up, they need to know that it's safe to do it. So this goes back all the way here to your established team agreements, which is why I'm so heavy on having a conflict infrastructure and why I'm teaching it both with my consulting clients and then also in my intensives. Your team agreement should give people the green light and the express permission to address harm when they experience it, to address problematic language when they witness it. People should know that it's okay to enforce codes of conduct, cultural values, team agreements, and generally accepted practices, and that it's not the role of the person who was harmed to address it or someone in management just because they're a leader. Yes, leaders should do it. They model what conflict intervention looks like, but all of us should know that we have the capability and the green light and the express permission to do it. That's why I'm so heavy on team agreements. So another thing about what's needed for people to speak up is that there has to be a level of psychological safety. And what psychological safety means, for those of you who aren't familiar with the jargon and the concepts from Amy E., it is, do I know if I speak up that I will not be harmed, that there will not be repercussions against me? And do I trust that people will hear me, take my word, and trust that I'm only raising this for the good of the collective? So if you don't have psychological safety, there isn't trust, there's not a green light agreement that you can hold people accountable, they're not going to speak up. And the other thing is that they are trying to call in somebody who has a higher rank than them, so a higher role in the organization, or if they are someone that has a social hierarchy that's different than theirs. So perhaps if they are an English language learning administrative assistant, it's harder for them to speak up when the person being called in is an English language dominant speaker who is older, perhaps a racial identity that has more social rank in that organization. It's just harder for them to do that. So you've got to be thinking about, do we have the conditions in place for people to speak up? And if not, it's going to be very hard for those bystanders to be able to speak up. Now, I still want to offer you a practice. So one thing that I will do in both my professional life and my personal life is maybe during the meeting, if I feel bold, or after the meeting with trusted bystanders who didn't speak up, I might go through these kinds of questions. So the first one is, hey, I want to talk to you about that meeting. Yeah, when that thing happens, what came up for you? What did you think? Or, what were you feeling? Just to get to the understanding, right? I mean, I gave you some hypotheses here about why folks don't speak up, but you get the opportunity to ask them straight away, what came up for you in the moment? You can also ask them, what made it hard for you to speak up? Especially if they've just told you they wanted to. And then this is the empowering question that helps to build, if I can call it bystander fuerte or bystander strength. What might happen, or rather, what might support look like for you the next time something like this happens? So let's fast forward to 2 months. And now you're in the meeting, you call someone in, and no one speaks up to have your back. What kind of support would you like for yourself? Because if we can start to make things personal, it helps to start that behavior change. And this is change management 101. The idea that one of the best and most effective change management practices, and this is, by the way, this is change management. One of the most effective change management strategies is you got to get people to see what has happened, to see the change that you're asking for. So in this instance, you want them to be speaking up, but you've got to also make them feel why it matters or why it might be necessary for them to speak up. So this is why asking them, what kind of support would you like if you called someone in the future? They can start to feel like, oh, whew, well, I want someone to speak up for me, even though I didn't do it for them. I want someone to speak up for me. And here's why that would matter. I would feel supported. I would feel heard. I'd feel not like I'm flailing alone out here on my own. Okay, you know what? If I'm a bystander or witness next time, I'm going to say something, even if I don't know the right words. Right? That's what this third question opens up. It's an actual practice to get folks to change their behavior. They're not going to change if you say, hey, you should have said something. Why didn't you say something? That's going to activate shame and blame. And we can't operate from a place of aspiration if we're coming from a place of blame and shame. All right. So that's that bystander piece I wanted to touch on. And the last I'll say here is a couple takeaways I hope you're pulling from is we've got to know our conflict story. We've got to know what triggers us. We've got to be paying attention to power dynamics. That was kind of an idea woven throughout all those examples. So when we go back to this case study again, and they said that they called someone in, they noticed defensiveness, and they wanted to know what to say to people who witnessed the exchange. This is what I would offer. In short, what you could do first is you want to recognize that defensiveness is almost always going to show up when you call folks in. Okay. So when you address the person, you also have to address the defensiveness. Imagine that it's an actual person or that's there physically. You have to address that defensiveness too. The next step you have to do is you have to be okay with recognizing you can only control your own behavior. So you can't get the person to change their behavior. You can't get them to be an open mind. You can't get them to engage in open dialogue. So I think that's part of your preparation work. The only job that you can control is how you show up in the exchange, and that you do so with empathy and care. And you are clear about what the misalignment was from their behavior to what the shared agreements were and why you called them the behavior. And then you can make a request. What is it that you would hope that would have been different? Or what do you hope would be different next time? You communicate that, and then it's on the other person to do with whatever they want with what you offered. And so it's almost this Buddhist sense of non-attachment, to not be attached to the outcome, to not be attached that they will change or that they won't be defensive, or that they will hear what you say and say, wow, you were right. I was wrong. I'll do better. We would want that response, but we can't be guaranteed that we would get it. And the next is that we know that in a space, if we just look at that microaggression case study example from the New York Times, that people are going to witness and see the same thing that you saw, but only 40% will speak on it and speak up in real time. So if you have a leadership role in this organization, part of what I would offer is how do you build people's skill set and confidence to speak up even when it's not perfect? How do you create conditions for psychological safety and trust so that people know, if I speak up, I won't get blacklisted, I won't get in trouble, I'm not going to lose opportunity because I either spoke up or co-signed on the person who spoke up? Doing all of those things can help you engage in a situation like this differently next time, more confident, more clear, less tied to the outcome, and knowing that for you, at the very least, you are the flag that's being waved to remind people, this is what we said we wanted. So what's our commitment to actually uphold this? And then that becomes a question for the group. You don't own the outcome. You just own the invitation to change. So I hope it was helpful to look at this real life workplace conflict. One thing that I try to really underscore with our clients is that, look, it's not always going to be perfect. A disagreement or misunderstanding at work is not always going to go the way that you want. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. That doesn't mean that we don't try to be the culture ambassador, waving the flag for how we should be. So here's what I want to invite you to. If you are curious about what is the state of conflict resiliency in your organization, I want you to go ahead and take this quiz that we have. You'll find it in the description. It is a conflict resiliency quiz to see what's the status of conflict resiliency or chaos on your team. You can get that diagnostic for free. And we also have another great resource also in the description. It is the Conflict Clarity Kit. So go ahead, grab those, see what support they can offer, and I would love to hear about it. If you have questions about your own workplace conflict, or you want to be a part of a future case study, if we make this a series, go ahead and send that to me. You can email Chrysta at recipefortransformation.com. We won't, as you see here, we won't use your name. We won't even reference your gender. Hopefully I didn't. We'll keep it as anonymous as we can, with the goal of using your experience as a learning opportunity for other folks. So with that, thanks for tuning in. If you're watching it on a replay, feel free to still comment. I would love to hear what you have to say. And with that, take care of yourself and others, and goodbye.